Can you imagine a single book, one book, causing a theological earthquake so powerful it literally splits a church right down the middle? Well, today we're going to get into the story of Questions on Doctrine. It's widely considered the most divisive publication in the entire history of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We're going to look at why it was even written in the first place, the secret meetings that shaped its content, the core beliefs that changed, and, believe me, how the aftershocks from this thing are still being felt today.
You know, it's not just me saying that. Prominent Adventist historian George R. Knight flat out calls it the most divisive book in the church's history. And that's a huge statement. So you have to ask yourself, how could a book of what seems like simple questions and answers ignite such an incredible firestorm? To really get it, we need to go back in time, back to the era that created it.
All right, so let's set the scene. Our story really kicks off in the 1950s. The Adventist Church was growing and fast, but it was also kind of an outsider, standing on the fringes of mainstream Christianity, and frankly, really looking for a way in.
So, by the 1950s, the Seventh-day Adventist Church is spreading all over the world. But here's the thing. With that kind of growth, you get a lot more attention, a lot more scrutiny. And to the big players in evangelical Protestantism, Adventism just looked weird. They were often getting slapped with the cult label, seen as this fringe group with strange, even heretical beliefs. Now, for a church that sees itself as thoroughly Christian, this label was more than just an insult. It was a huge roadblock, and you can bet it was a massive source of frustration for the leadership.
So what was it that made them seem so different? Well, it was the very things that defined their identity. You've got worship on a Saturday Sabbath, not Sunday, a firm belief in the prophetic writings of a woman named Ellen G. White, and then there's this really unique understanding of what Christ is doing right now in a heavenly sanctuary. It's a whole concept tied to a final judgment phase. They call it the investigative judgment, which they believe started way back in 1844. Now, to Adventists, these were absolute pillars of their faith, but to outsiders, these were giant red flags, basically markers of a cult. The pressure to just be more normal was building up big time.
So this put the church in a really tough spot, a real crossroads. The big question was, how do you bridge that gap to mainstream Christianity? How do you finally shake that awful cult label without giving up the very beliefs that make you who you are? And it was this one fundamental question that set the stage for a series of secret talks that would, no exaggeration, change the church forever.
So how did the church leadership respond to this problem? Well, not out in the open. It wasn't debated at a big church conference. Nope. It all happened in secret, behind closed doors.
It all started pretty quietly, really. A single letter from an Adventist pastor in 1949 just cracked the door open, a tiny bit. But the real spark that lit the fuse came in 1954. That's when a guy named Walter Martin, who was a really well-known author on American cults, was told to write a book exposing Adventism. But Martin wanted to be fair, so he actually reached out to the Adventist leadership. And that one request, it kicked off 18 straight months of intense, secret meetings between 1955 and 1956.
And these negotiations weren't happening with a big committee. It was a very small, very specific group. On the Adventist side, you had two main guys, Leroy Froom, a respected scholar, and Roy Allen Anderson, who was head of the Ministerial Association. And on the evangelical side, you had Walter Martin, of course, and his powerful colleague Donald Gray Barnhouse, the editor of Eternity magazine. Just these four men, really, would end up reshaping Adventist theology.
And let me just stress this again. This entire dialogue was happening in complete secret. The vast majority of Adventist pastors, their own theologians, and especially the church members, they had absolutely no clue. Think about that. Decisions that would affect the core beliefs of the entire church were being made by just a handful of men with zero oversight. And this secrecy, this would become a massive point of anger in the firestorm that was about to erupt.
Okay, so this brings us to the real heart of the issue. What exactly was talked about, and what was changed during these secret meetings? Look, these weren't just tiny tweaks or minor adjustments. The concessions that were made struck right at the very foundation of what Adventists had historically believed. All right, first up, the human nature of Christ. Now, the long-standing historic Adventist teaching, and this was heavily supported by Ellen G. White's writings, was this. When Jesus came to earth, he took on human nature after the fall of Adam. That means a fallen, sinful nature, with the same tendencies and vulnerabilities to sin that you and I face every single day. The absolute miracle in their view was that in this fallen nature, he lived a completely sinless life. And this was key because it showed that we, through his power, could also live a life of victory over sin. But the new view presented to the evangelicals was a complete 180. This new position, which was carefully worded to be more acceptable to them, said that Christ was exempt from all the inherited passions and pollutions that corrupt us. In other words, he took on the nature of Adam before the fall. Now, this might sound like we're splitting theological hairs here, but the implications are absolutely massive. Because if Christ didn't have our same fallen nature, then his victory over sin isn't really the same kind of victory we need to have. It changes the whole dynamic.
Okay, the second huge doctrine they tackled was the atonement. Historically, Adventists taught a two-phase atonement. The way they saw it, the sacrifice on the cross was absolutely perfect, totally sufficient. But it was only the beginning of the process. It was phase one. They believed that Christ's atoning work kept going after he went to heaven, and that it would finish with a final phase of judgment, that investigative judgment we mentioned, which started, according to their prophecies, in 1844.
Well, the new formulation was, again, starkly different, and it was designed specifically to line up with mainstream Protestantism. It stated very clearly that the atonement was not some ongoing process. No, it was fully and finally completed on the cross. Period. And with that one sentence, they effectively erased the entire theological reason for the Church's unique sanctuary message and the importance of the year 1844. Two ideas that were absolutely central to what it meant to be an Adventist.
And believe me, it didn't stop there. There were other huge revisions. During the talks, the Adventist leaders actually told the evangelicals that the whole idea of Christ starting a second ministering work in 1844 was, and I quote, totally repudiated. Then they changed how they talked about Ellen G. White. They repositioned her writings, saying they were not on the same level as the Bible. Now, for a church that had always seen her as a genuine messenger from God, this was an unbelievable concession, made specifically to make their critics happy.
So when all these secret talks and huge doctrinal changes finally came out into the open, it wasn't because the church leadership made a big announcement. Not at all. It came out just as one magazine predicted it would, like a bombshell.
It was September 1956, and Donald Barnhouse's magazine, Eternity, is the one that broke the story. So picture this. You're an Adventist pastor or a teacher or just a regular church member, and you pick up an evangelical magazine and you start reading that your own church has just disowned some of its most fundamental beliefs. People were caught completely off guard. The shock, the confusion, it was instant and it was everywhere.
About a year later, in 1957, all these new positions were made official in a book titled Seventh-day Adventists Answer Questions on Doctrine. It was presented as the new authoritative statement of faith. The goal was for this book to be the bridge that finally connected them to the evangelical world. But instead of building a bridge, it blew one up, creating a deep and permanent fault line right through the middle of Adventism itself.
The backlash was almost immediate, and the opposition found its champion in a man named M.L. Andreasen. Now, Andreasen was one of the church's most senior and respected theologians. He went through this new book with a fine-tooth comb and came back saying he'd found 17 major deviations from historic Adventist doctrine. He was convinced the leadership had betrayed the faith, and he started publishing his objections, which just fanned the flames of an already raging debate.
And in what was just a stunning move, the church leaders didn't try to sell these as new and improved understandings. No. Instead, they claimed that the views in Questions on Doctrine had always been the real belief of the, quote, sane leadership, and all those other views, the ones held by the majority of the church for decades, well, they dismissed all of that as the work of a lunatic fringe. You can just imagine how that went over. That kind of language was incredibly insulting and just poured gasoline on the fire.
But despite all the protests, the church leadership pushed forward with a massive campaign to promote the book. And get this, by 1970, there were more than 138,000 copies of Questions on Doctrine out there in the world, systematically spreading this new theology to every corner of the church. So that peace and unity the leadership was hoping for? It never happened. The publication of Questions on Doctrine did the exact opposite. It unleashed decades of theological chaos and division, and the church is still dealing with the fallout to this day.
Really, the book's legacy is one of deep division. What it did was create two very clear opposing camps. You had what became known as traditional Adventism for those who held on to the historic beliefs, and then you had progressive or evangelical Adventism for those who embraced these new ideas. The conflict got so heated that eventually the church just stopped printing the book for years. Think about that. The book that was supposed to be their definitive statement of faith was allowed to go out of print because it was just too hot to handle. And maybe the most damaging legacy of all was the climate of suspicion it created. The secrecy, the name-calling, it caused a serious loss of trust in church leadership that lingered for a long, long time.
But this whole doctrinal earthquake didn't just split the church apart, it also sparked a powerful reaction. A counter-movement started to rise up from the ashes, a movement completely dedicated to bringing back what they saw as the original, pure, uncompromised Adventist message.
So the question is, how did this massive fight over the nature of Christ and the atonement lead directly to the rise of one of the most interesting and also controversial ideas in modern Adventism, something called last-generation theology? Well, that's a story for our next explainer.